journalists in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and certainly in Afghanistan, particularly at the moment, have an enormously difficult task to do, and in a situation that I think would defeat almost anybody in terms of being safe, but also managing to get to the truth. I think the plan put forward now by the Arab League, the idea of rebuilding Gaza, piling money perhaps from countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, in there to give people in Gaza a reason for hope. Perhaps the vision of Donald Trump as a sort of American or Israeli-controlled beach resort. But perhaps it could be a place where people could live.
Hello and welcome to the Muslim Viewpoint, a new video podcast series powered by the nonprofit national media platform American Muslim Today. I'm your host, Maya Gayler. Today, we are joined by Roger Hearing, a seasoned journalist with Bloomberg and the BBC. During his career, Roger has covered 9 wars and 22 elections, revolutions, and other major events in the world. He has reported both locally and internationally. So hello, Roger. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. And
yes,
may I say also Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you. So you have had an extensive career in journalism spanning over 35 years. In your experience, what's been the most challenging aspect of working as a journalist in today's media landscape in contrast to maybe where you started?
Well, I started off on newspapers a very long time ago, and obviously things have changed a lot since then. And I've mostly been in broadcasting, working for the BBC. And I suppose perhaps the most challenging thing is always getting people to express themselves to you in ways that are accessible to everyone else, because most people have their own little world, I suppose, in which they operate. I do too, I'm sure. But part of my job is to try and get people to speak in ways that engage a much wider audience. And that's challenging, but I think I've managed to do a fair bit of that over the years.
Yeah, and you've had the opportunity to report directly from war zones, specifically in Afghanistan and Iraq. So can you tell us about the differences that you noticed in how these wars are covered by Western media versus the local media there in the country?
Well, very much. I was going to say, in those sort of places, the local media often isn't very organized or able to function that well, partly because of the ongoing war. That was certainly true in Iraq, where, of course, they also, in the time of Saddam Hussein, were very restricted in what they were able to do or say. There's some immensely talented journalists in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and certainly in Afghanistan, particularly at the moment, have an enormously difficult task to do, and in a situation that I think would defeat almost anybody in terms of being safe, but also managing to get to the truth. And that's what it's all about. So I'd say there are lots of interesting differences, I suppose, between those two countries and working in them. When I was working in Iraq, obviously it was back in 2003, particularly during a period of invasion from the outside world, where there was an attempt to change the regime, which of course did succeed in the end. And then afterwards, that whole period of societal breakdown, really. And the challenges there for local journalists, but also, of course, for us operating, was trying to get the news out and survive the experience, frankly.
Yeah, and do you believe that there were any biases from the Western media whenever covering these conflicts?
Bias is a difficult thing to determine. I mean, we all come at things with a bias. That's almost inevitable. But certainly we try, certainly when I work for the BBC, we try to make sure that we cover both sides, as many sides of an argument or a dispute as there are, and try to give a reasonably equal weight, I think, to many of the arguments involved. Inevitably, we as outsiders come with our own prejudices about situations. We've learnt about things in the past. We have a whole series of understandings, we think, about the situation. And the challenge is very much to be able to get beyond those. And, answering your question, I think certainly the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq have both been reported in ways sometimes that perhaps failed to understand, I think, what was really going on there. I don't think it was deliberate in most cases. I think people came to it, tried to come to these things with an open mind. But part of the problem with being the sort of journalist I am, where you go into a place, maybe a place you've never been before, is how on earth do you even have a framework within which to put your understanding? And the answer to that is to listen. It's to listen to people there. It's to listen to the people you're talking to and try not to frame too much without listening and try and use the context that those people can give you. But then again, the counter argument, a long answer, I'm afraid, is that people there very often will have an axe to grind. Of course they do. Everyone does everywhere. People will say certain things within a context. In Iraq, for example, the problem was you had communities that didn't have a great love for each other in many ways. I'm talking about the Shiites, obviously, in Iraq, the Sunnis, the Kurds, all of whom had history, difficulties, long-running disputes, and trying to work together as one country was an immensely difficult thing for that country. It was a construction anyway, a post-colonial construction of a country. So how do you get beyond what people are saying necessarily, understand what they're saying, take into account what they're saying, but also understand that sometimes people are saying things for a reason, because they have an axe to grind. That's not unreasonable. It's just getting to know what that is.
Right. Thank you for that. And then I want to shift us to the United States, where we're based. So Donald Trump is once again president, and he is known for, framing the media as, quote, fake news. And currently he has banned the AP News from the White House. So from your perspective as a journalist, how do you think Trump's constant attacks on the media impact the credibility of the press?
Well, I'm not working in America, obviously, at the moment, so it's hard for me to say close up, and I shouldn't pretend that I know things I don't. But I can imagine from certainly speaking to colleagues, it is very difficult. He has a particular way of handling news conferences that is quite unique, I think. I think many of my colleagues are struggling to deal with that, really, because he likes to say things in a very big and loud way, and people have to deal with that. And this old trope of, take him seriously, just don't take him literally. It's a very difficult thing, I think, for the media to work around that. And obviously he attacks, that's part of his thing, and he attacks the mainstream media, exactly as you say, and undermines them. But at the same time, it is the job and the responsibility of the media in America and the media globally to try to represent fairly, accurately, comprehensively what is going on. I mean, a huge dilemma for Associated Press, exactly what you said, because I think they refuse to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. How does one deal with that? I mean, it's an immensely difficult situation. Thank God in Britain, we haven't really had to deal with those kind of problems so far. There are many countries I have been in where these problems exist. How do you compromise as the media in order to get access to the stories, or do you stand on principle and perhaps not get access to stories? And how does that really help people? And sometimes my government back in the day would make life difficult. I mean, this goes back a very long way, but there was a point where Northern Ireland was a big issue in the news. And the government of the day, the Conservative government, said that the voices of some of the leaders of the Republican side could not be broadcast. And when they said that, I think, in the end, the broadcasters got around it by having actors voice these people. And in the end, it was hard to tell which was which, so it had no effect. What it did do, however, when I was working in Africa particularly, I would be talking to heads of state there, perhaps, and they would say, well, look how you deal with your rebels. You don't give them a voice. Why should we allow you to go and talk to our opposition? So sometimes your credibility can be undermined by your own side, which can cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, and so looking at the current state of democracy in the West, in the US, and in Europe, do you think that democratic institutions are under threat? And if so, how should journalists and media outlets respond to upholding these democratic values?
I don't feel, certainly in Europe or most of Europe, that the democracy itself is under threat. I do think there is a problem with, again, a certain sort of politician, perhaps some of them in the Donald Trump mode, who are there, who don't play by the rules that we're used to. Why should they? I mean, they can set their own rules, of course, and we have to adapt to that. But I think journalists need just to keep very, very close in their minds this idea that we are there as public servants. We are there to do the best we can in providing information, news, and context in as fair a way and accurate a way as possible. And as long as you just keep that there, then you should be able to stick to what is the right thing for journalists to do. It is a huge challenge. I mean, on my podcast that I am on as well, my own podcast called the Y Curve, ycurve.com, if anyone wants to look, we try and get people in to talk about things in a way that goes outside perhaps the normal areas of journalism. The why are things happening in this way? Hence the title of the podcast. And I think that's quite a good way of pushing things. Not only what happens or how it happens, but why it happens, and try and address that. And sometimes I think that can help things forward at a time of great challenge to journalism.
Yes, and I do want to discuss your podcast, but first I just want to ask really quick. So, how do you anticipate Trump's return might possibly influence foreign policy?
Gosh, well, that is the question of the moment in a way, certainly for us outside the United States. It has been a real, well, I mean, you can use any cliche, a roller coaster ride, some might say, so far. And of course, he hasn't been in office for that long. It has been extraordinary. And I mean, what will come next, nobody really knows. Some people have said, well, it's a bull in a china shop. You know, a lot of the things we all thought we knew about foreign policy and where you had to be careful, sensitivity, you just ride straight over them. And some people think that will, in the end, cause immense trouble. It already has, but perhaps on a wider scale, perhaps conflict where there didn't need to be conflict. On the other hand, maybe we've all got a bit too conservative with a small c in our attitude to the key questions of foreign policy, and it needs someone like him to come in and turn everything over. And then some of the really bad problems that have been going on forever, a kind of stalemate, maybe can change if you think about them in a different way. Perhaps he'll force people's hand to actually do something, to change something. I mean, Gaza is an interesting situation in that regard. Many people thought, and still think, that he has behaved very badly over that, in terms of perhaps favouring one side in all this very dramatically, and at the same time not really giving due consideration to the rights, for example, of the Palestinians in Gaza. Why should they move out of their home? But if you disregard that and say, well, what actually will change? Maybe something good will come of it. I don't know. I would love to think so. I visited Gaza many times. I have many friends there. What happened has been an absolute disaster. Maybe it's a triumph of hope over experience, but perhaps things will change for the better. I do hope so.
Right, and that leads me to my next question, which is about an episode of your podcast, specifically where you and your co host discuss the Israeli Gaza conflict. And it was said that the IDF maybe doesn't seem to understand that the destruction and devastation they inflict in turn creates these militants and extremists of the future. So, can you tell us more about this?
Well, it's hardly an original position in a way. Of course, your own former Secretary of State, in fact, Anthony Blinken, said precisely this, I think, his last major speech before he left office. But it is something I have come across in a lot of places where people who are angry, often young, often male, feel they have little choice in life, feel their options are very, very limited, and they feel angry because not just of that, but also, of course, things done to their families, to their members of their family, to members of their people in very different ways, and want revenge. It's a natural human thing to do that, to feel that. And the problem with dealing with what happened in Gaza is if you create lots of these people who have an angle, they have an angst, they remember seeing their sister's body in the rubble. That is something that will power people to violence. I'm not defending it for 1 second. I'm not saying there is any justification for that. But I do think that is a natural human reaction in many ways, and one that the actions of the IDF, and I've worked, I've worked in that part of the world a lot. I have met many people, senior people in the IDF. They are, in many cases, very humane, very reasonable, very intelligent people who are doing the job they think they need to do. But I think at some level, perhaps because of the political drive in Israel, some of those soldiers have been put in positions where they do things they should not do. And I think many of the generals realize that the consequences could be extremely bad going forward. But somehow they don't seem to be able to get out of a cycle of revenge and counter revenge. And this goes nowhere for anyone. So, yes, I think it is a huge tragedy that they have done this. Tragedy in the human terms, of course, the vast numbers of people who've died. And we shouldn't forget, of course, the horrible incident on October the 7th that set all this in train, although, of course, that had precedents as well, going back a long way. There has to be some way out of this. But I think piling destruction on a small area of territory like Gaza, and I say I worked there many, many times, I know what it's like, just achieves almost nothing. It doesn't destroy perhaps the political organization they're trying to destroy, and what it does create is a lot of potential bombers of the future.
Yeah. So, what, in your opinion, what is the solution to this? What is Netanyahu's and the Israeli government's way out, or concrete end to this conflict?
I wish I knew. I mean, as I say, it's obviously the last period has been appalling. I mean, worst I've seen, but I have been reporting on this part of the world going back the first Intifada, the second Intifada. I have seen this in many forms, and it seems, awful cliched phrase or word, intractable, because you have people on either side, on both sides, who see it as a zero-sum game. They see it as one side's benefit is the other's disbenefit, and that's all there is to it. So in terms of a solution, apart from a kind of understanding, somehow, an ability to recognize the human on the other side, I can't see a way out of it. And some of the stories when I was in Gaza, I remember there was an extraordinary guy I met on the way coming through on the border who was an ice cream maker. He sold ice cream in Gaza, a very good ice cream maker, to the extent that in the days before the conflict, people had traveled down from Tel Aviv, Israelis, to come and buy ice cream from this man. And it was a picture of a time, I'm sure it wasn't a perfect time, but a time when people could, to some extent, live together. And now, God knows what's happened to his ice cream store. I expect it's completely destroyed. I mean, that in itself doesn't matter, but it's indicative of a nightmare scenario, really, of mutual destruction, mutual hate growing. Perhaps the answer, in a way, the two-state solution, I mean, it's much derided by many. But I think something of that kind has to be the way forward. I think the plan put forward now by the Arab League, the idea of rebuilding Gaza, piling money perhaps from countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, in there to give people in Gaza a reason for hope. That, I think, does hold perhaps some hope in it. When I was there again, I remember seeing the ruins of a Club Mediterranee that they tried to build there back in the days of the Oslo Agreement. And of course, nothing came of it. I mean, it's as a piece of land on the Mediterranean coast, of course, it could become something really nice, not in perhaps the vision of Donald Trump as a sort of American or Israeli-controlled beach resort. But perhaps it could be a place where people could live in a proper human way. And the frustration, even before all this destruction in Gaza, was that it was an open-air prison. People couldn't leave. And when the bombing started, they couldn't leave either. So they were trapped. The worst possible imaginable situation for them. So perhaps that Arab League plan will take off. I hope it does. I think it might be a way to at least give people in Gaza that thing, hope, which is what they need.
Right. And shifting us more to a broader view here, just about media. So, as you might have noticed, media bias is frequently criticized, particularly whenever it comes to political reporting. So, from your perspective, if how can journalists remain balanced and objective in their coverage? Or, do you think we should keep leaning towards this new? I feel like now all of our media has a bias, has a lean, because that's what audiences want to see. So can you just tell us your thoughts about this?
Well, I suppose, I should caveat this by saying I obviously come from a BBC background where it's absolutely the DNA is at least trying to be unbiased, to be balanced. Now, I mean, we don't always get it right. I would never say we do that, but we try. And I think the move towards the journalism of attachment, if you like, the journalism of bias, of overt bias, is not helpful because, in a way, if you are reporting from one side, specifically of a situation, politics or whatever, but almost by definition, you're not giving a complete picture. You are not doing the service, if you like, that you owe to your viewers or listeners. So I think what you have to do, particularly if you're working in a democracy, is say to people, look, there are people who say this, there are people who say that, there are people who think this, there are people who think that. We're not going to make your mind up for you, but we will try to give you as an accurate a picture as we can of what the viewpoints are and why they have them. And to me, that is what we should be doing. I mean, if you're going to report a story from only one point of view, why even bother? People will make up their own minds anyway. I don't see the value of it, but you're right. I do see a lot more of it out there. People taking a particular view. Views, not news, it seems to me, is what we have. There's a place for that, but I don't think it should be in the news area.
Right. And so just a last question. So can you share with us some strategies that you've adopted and upheld to give honest and authentic reporting?
Well, I think it's a very simple thing, really. It's trying to understand the context. You have to ask all those traditional questions journalists are supposed to ask of themselves: why, when, what, how, and put those answers together. Give context to it. Why has this thing happened? What is going on at the moment? What could happen next? But do it understanding that you don't have the complete picture. This is the other thing. Don't assume that you know everything about it. Have doubt, if you like. Don't try and convince your viewers and listeners and readers that you are, omniscient. You know everything that's going. You don't. You can't. But say, from what we understand, from what I understand, this person thinks this person thinks that, this person has done this. Check it out. Try and make sure you check the accuracy of whatever it is you're hearing. The worst thing at the moment, I think, is that people, mainly through social media, will hear or be told things and will make the working assumption that they are being told them because they're true. And unfortunately, it's good that you have a democratization of journalism, that anyone can put out their news there, citizen journalists, but citizen journalists are not trained to filter, to say, why is this person telling me this? What other sources of information are there? So what you get is unvarnished, and people are not used to filtering it, unfortunately. So they just believe what they hear or they see, and that distorts the public argument, the public discussion. And going back to an earlier point you made about democracy, that's a difficulty for democracy, because if people are making decisions based on false narratives, that democracy is not going to work.
Right. Well, thank you again, Roger, for joining us today. And then can you just tell people where they can find you?
Well, you can certainly find me on the ycurve.com, ycurve.com, WHYCURVE.com. And there's a range of very interesting podcasts and discussions there, which are on all things, not just politics, all kinds of things. And I recommend it. But thank you very much for having me on your podcast. Thank you.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Thank you for joining me on Muslim Viewpoint. If you value our public service journalism, please support American Muslim Today, a 501c3 nonprofit, by following us on social media and American Muslim Today, or donating at AmericanMuslimToday.com. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Maya Gayler.